Representative Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin is chairman of the new House Select Committee on Engagement with the Chinese Communist Party. He is also the author of a Wall Street Journal editorial this morning. The headline is Stand Up to China's Bullying and Defend Taiwan. Subhead, The Island Nation is a Candle Against the Darkness of the Communist Party. Chairman Gallagher, welcome back. I gather you went to Taiwan. You didn't tell me about it. You and Joe Biden don't keep me abreast of your travel plans. When did you go to Taiwan?
Well, Hugh, I just your operational security was suspect, and so I felt like I had to keep it in the dark. I went the
Dwayne
night
is
after we
here.
talked last week, so I took the direct out of O'Hare and was there for 4 days on the ground, and it was a very fruitful trip. Met with President Tsai, met with Vice President Lai, who's likely to be the DPP candidate for president in the January 2024 election. Met with their Minister of Defense, met with the head of their intel community. Met with their foreign minister, met with their national security advisor. So it was a very productive 4 days on the ground and had a wide range of discussion. I think the thing that stands out more than anything else is the fact that, we need to be moving faster to deliver on the foreign military sales items that they've purchased. We're nearing $20 billion worth of equipment that has yet to be delivered, including some Stingers and Javelins that they purchased in 2015. And we have yet to deliver. So at the same time, we're lecturing the Taiwanese about investing in asymmetric defense. Well, we need to provide the asymmetric weapons that they've purchased that would allow them to defend their country. And time is not on our side. The threat from China is real. China is attempting to meddle in their upcoming election. And so we just need to be moving heaven and earth to arm Taiwan to the teeth before it's too late.
Chairman Gallagher, I have never been to Taiwan, and I've been to Hong Kong, I've been to Japan, I've just never been to Taiwan. Give our Steelers fans some idea of what that island nation is like.
Well, it's incredibly easy to get to, and it's incredibly safe. And Taipei is a very modern city. So I think your listeners would love a visit there. I mean, it's first world city in Taipei. It's absolutely beautiful. I mean, one thing that I think going there gives you an appreciation for. Well, let me say two things. One, just how remarkable the Taiwanese experiment is. I mean, you're talking about a country that transitioned from authoritarian rule to democracy effectively bloodlessly, which is rare, if not unprecedented in modern history. And the second thing is the terrain is very, very difficult. I mean, this is a difficult military problem for the PLA to solve. Not only just the difficulties inherent to conducting an amphibious landing, but just the vegetation, the hills, the fact that it's an island makes it very difficult to conquer. That being said, and the Taiwanese are very conscious of this, if the good news is that it's an island, the bad news is that it's an island, and it'd be very difficult to resupply in the event of a conflict. All the more reason why we need to be surging and stockpiling munitions to the island now before the shooting starts. And almost every Taiwanese leader that I spoke to brought up the issue of Ukraine as a wake-up call in terms of the risks of modern warfare, the risks of authoritarian aggression, and they are on the front lines of authoritarian aggression. In my op-ed, I sort of referenced a speech that President Tsai gave at their National Day last year in October, where she talked about that, and she also talked about the fact that to say I am Taiwanese is a statement of honor, given everything that Taiwan has accomplished in recent years. But your listeners, I think, would love a visit there, and I would encourage Americans to go to Taiwan. It's also just massively
I'm going to have to
economic.
explore getting there because you don't really understand a place till you put eyes on it and being there. I never understood Hong Kong until I actually got there and wandered around, and the same true of Japan. Chairman Gallagher, there's a debate in the Republican Party about the amount of lethal military aid we ought to give to Ukraine. I'm a hawk. I want more and better, faster, including A-16s and F-16s and A-10s. A-10s would change a lot on that static front line in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians can fly them. It's not a hard plane to learn how to fly, and they can probably fly the F-16. Some Republicans like Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence agree with me. Other Republicans like Ron DeSantis say no blank check. And then some Republicans like former President Trump came out and called people like me warmongers, but that's fine. I'm not a decision maker. What do you think about aid to Ukraine? Where are you on that spectrum? And what factual scenario unfolding in the next year would persuade you were wrong? I've answered that question by saying if Ukraine collapses and we've given them everything, then I would have been wrong. If we end up with HIMARS and advanced weaponry in the Russian hands for sale to China, what say you on both those questions?
Well, to the first, I signed a letter last week, a bipartisan letter, calling on the administration to provide Ukraine with increased air superiority, including F-16s and similar fourth-generation aircraft, as soon as possible. The Ukrainians also need ATACMS along with cluster munitions. They really want cluster munitions, and we have them. We have the ability to provide dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, Great Eagle drones. And so, as I've talked with you before, Hugh, it just seems like we're always in this cycle of the administration dragging their feet, giving us the same excuse that this would be too provocative. And then ultimately they're forced into providing a system, and it doesn't prove provocative. It proves deadly for Russia on the battlefield. The second thing, what would persuade me that I'm wrong? Yeah, similarly, if we've given this level of support and the Ukrainians still lose on the battlefield, I do think it's fair for skeptics to point out that certain Western European allies, Germany in particular, need to put more skin in the game. They need to step up. The other thing that I think would be a massive missed opportunity is if we didn't take advantage of what Ukraine has exposed in terms of the fragility of our defense industrial base in order to turbocharge our production of key weapon systems, because many of them are the same ones we need to arm Taiwan and to prevent a war, our systems that we're using in Ukraine. And so if we don't use this to revitalize our defense industrial base, I think that would be a massive failure. The final thing I'd say, Hugh, is that many Taiwanese leaders I mentioned, particularly their director general of something called NSP, the head of their intel agency, talked about the increasing strategic convergence between Russia and China, and how Putin is increasingly China's junior partner in this new
A vassal state, right? It's becoming a vassal state like Iran.
And so for critics of our aid to Ukraine to suggest that we could somehow isolate that problem and thereby reinvest resources into the Pacific, I think misunderstands the de facto alliance that we're seeing on display between Russia and China. And so I think we need to do a better job of teasing out the connection and the partnership between these two countries.
Congressman Gallagher, I think General Secretary Xi has flipped the script from 1972. He's going to go to Moscow in the next few months. That's been announced in the Wall Street Journal today, which is an echo of the flip script of Nixon going to Beijing. The stronger partner goes to the weaker partner in the three-way superpower competition. I think that's going to happen, and I think the reality of the new axis of evil, Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran, is there. And Americans have to open their eyes. It's really one enemy. And I mean, they're an enemy. They're an adversary. Agree or disagree?
I agree. Well, whenever I'm asked, is China our enemy? I say, well, the Chinese Communist Party is the enemy of freedom everywhere it exists, and it's the enemy of the Chinese people. Chinese people need not be our enemy. In fact, they're the primary victims of the Chinese Communist Party's aggression. And understanding that distinction, I think, is critical to our effort. Basically, if you look back to the No Limits partnership that was signed between Putin and Xi before the invasion, you saw similar rhetoric about color revolutions. These are two leaders that share a sense of historical revisionism, grievance, a desire to sort of reclaim the glories that were lost long ago for their countries. And though they are strange bedfellows, though they have diverging interests in some areas, they're very good at presenting a united front against their main enemy, the United States. And so they don't hesitate to think about us, to talk about us as an adversary, even as we sometimes clutch pearls in terms of the language we use to describe these evil, evil regimes.
Is the CCP's long game? I think it is, but I think they eventually intend to get Manchuria back. Russia took it from them. And they intend to exploit Russia's natural resources in the way that they need natural resource exploitation from Africa and Cambodia. They are expansionists, and Russia just can't oppose that. They're so desperate. Putin's worried about hanging on to power, I think, at this point. So Xi's going to have the keys to the Kremlin. And I don't think I'm being an alarmist here. I think that's the reality.
Well, right now he's got the keys to the gas station of the Kremlin. He's getting energy on the cheap as a result of the war in Ukraine. You mentioned their territorial ambitions. Another thing that was really evident in my trip to Taiwan, and so many Taiwanese leaders brought it up, is the fact that the CCP's takeover of Hong Kong put a stake in the heart of this idea of one country, two systems, which is the same sort of fiction they were using in terms of their relationship with Taiwan, such that Xi Jinping's closest advisor, Wang Huning, sort of the chief ideological architect of the Chinese Communist Party, I'm told is revising their entire doctrine with respect to Taiwan, because even they understand that one country, two systems is not something the Taiwanese people are going to buy anytime soon. As I've said to you multiple times before, what happens in Taiwan won't stay in Taiwan. What happens in Xinjiang won't stay in Xinjiang. This is Xinjiang in particular is a laboratory they're using to perfect their instruments of repression, and it's a model they intend to export around the world.
Did any of your colleagues on the select committee accompany you to Taiwan?
Representative Ro Khanna and Jake Auchincloss were there. We overlapped in terms of our trips, and we did some joint meetings, which was great to have a bipartisan meeting. We did one meeting in particular with Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, the world semiconductor superpower, 91 years old. That was a fascinating meeting. We talked about economic and tech issues. One final thing I'd highlight, Hugh, because it often gets lost in our agenda. We need an economic and trade agenda with Taiwan. The security piece is more obvious, but we're making little progress on a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I think that's essential. We're the only G7 country that doesn't have a double taxation agreement with Taiwan, which is a huge disincentive for Taiwanese investment in the United States, because it's effectively taxed not twice, but 3 times, and it makes no economic sense for them to invest money in the United States. So there's all sorts of things we could do on the economic side that would further enhance our partnership with Taiwan. And oh, by the way, the Taiwanese make great whiskey. If that's something you're interested in, Hugh, Cavalan, I would highly recommend it. And you can use it in a Wisconsin old fashioned. So many things to love about Taiwan.
A Wisconsin old fashioned? What in the world is a Wisconsin old fashioned? Is that like a sheep drinking beer? What is that? With some cheese in it? A Wisconsin old fashioned. Someone's got to send me the recipe for that.
Instead of an orange garnish, it's just a cheese curd garnish.
That's a cheese curd. By the way, the Wisconsin Supreme Court primary last night, that race is going to matter a lot in April, isn't it?
Big time. We need all the help we can get. I mean, that's can't overstate the importance of that race.
Well, we will talk about that down the road. Chairman Gallagher, thank you. Follow him on Twitter at Rep Gallagher. Follow me to the next segment, America, of this hour of The Hugh Hewitt Show. Hi, it's Hugh Hewitt. Eric McTaxis's new book, Letter to the American Church, is a must-read wake-up call for American Christians on what needs to be done now and, in fact, needed to be done yesterday. Get Letter to the American Church. For me, I'm joined now by Jim Geraghty, Morning Jolt senior political analyst for National Review, Washington Post columnist, and extraordinary bon vivant around Washington, D.C. We see him in cigar bars and martini bars, wherever we go on Capitol Hill. Jim Geraghty is there, and he got there first. And he stays late. Jim Geraghty, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh.
Now, my first question to you is, I read your Washington Post column on which Republican is going to out-hawk each other on China. But since then, a divide has developed in the Republican Party on Ukraine. Ukraine hawks like Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and Nikki Haley versus the former president who's out with a denunciation of warmongers, and then Ron DeSantis in between saying no blank checks. How do you describe that spectrum? How significant is that compared to the China spectrum? And is this going to be a national security primary for the Republicans?
I think it will be, if not primarily, a national security primary. I think it'll be issue 2, issue 3. It'll be up there. It'll be pretty high. Probably the economy will be front and center. Also, we should not dismiss cultural war type issues. But this is going to be in the mix, and it's going to be a pretty big part of it. President Trump continues to have I could work out a deal in a couple of days. This thing is easy. I don't know. There are no doubt some people want to believe that. I don't think that's particularly accurate or useful contribution to the conversation. I think what you saw in DeSantis' statement is probably what carefully calibrated to what Republicans are thinking right now, which can be a little bit contradictory because the average Republican does not have warm and fuzzy feelings about Vladimir Putin. I think they see Russia as the aggressor. I think there are legitimate points to be made that the U.S. is not made of money, that our stockpiles of certain weapons have been depleted, and that there's a certain, there's a question of, okay, we want to help Ukraine. Are our European allies doing enough? Those are all fair, legitimate points to be raised in this discussion. I think, by the way, the Biden administration will pour gasoline on the fire if they respond to points like this with "you're a Putin lover." that you're, only doing this because Russia stole the 2016 election, and you guys have loved Putin ever since, yada yada yada. I think the average Republican looks at the average Republican who pays attention to foreign policy and who looks at this and says, "Well, look, we are seeing the Russian military get significantly, depleted, and we don't have to risk any U.S. troops to do it. And this is significant. And we are, building towards a point where Russia can no longer credibly threaten its Eastern European neighbors, which is a really good outcome for the United States in this. We also may be sending a rather significant deterrent effect to China to say, hey, you guys might be thinking that you can take over Taiwan, but look, Russia thought taking over Ukraine was going to be a special military operation that was going to take 2 or 3 days. Look how that's turning out for them. Are you guys sure you want to go ahead with this? I don't see this as being a big factor in the typical Republican primary voters' thinking, but I do think it is worth noting the argument of the Elbridge-Colby types who says that, well, we can't really help Ukraine and fully help be as strong in the Pacific and protect Taiwan the way we'd like to. And I think that is a real argument that needs to be addressed by supporters of more support.
There's another argument from the Hawks, which is it's not the size of the check you write, it's what does it buy. And so President Biden said $500 billion new aid, and I love the Kyiv visit. It's the best thing a president who can't communicate, won't give interviews can do is show up and walk around. And that certainly helped the Ukrainian people rally and it's the President of the United States in your war-torn capital. It was a great day, the best day of a terrible presidency. That's what I've described. But when Ron DeSantis says no blank check, I thought to myself, what's the shrewdness there? And it's really a question of what, not the size of the package. What are you sending blankets and MREs, or are you sending F-16s and A-10s, which will win the ground battle? So I asked this question, Jim. Are you a Ukraine aid hawk like I am? More, faster, more lethal weapons?
Yeah. By and large, I think this is helping U.S. interests. This is weakening Russia. This is sending an important signal around the world that aggression does not pay, that big countries cannot simply go in and take over smaller countries.
Okay, so the question I ask you, and I've asked callers, is if you're a war military aid hawk or a military aid dove, what events would happen that a year from now would lead you to conclude you were wrong?
I think it is fair to ask whether our approach from the beginning, let me step back. The first observation is if you want to help Ukraine, and you recognize we are in a de facto state of war, and having Joe Biden in charge during all of it makes you nervous, I feel you. I get the idea at which you might think this is a worthwhile endeavor led by a guy who is habitually indecisive and who's going to screw this up. I see where somebody's coming from when they have that kind of perspective. Ideally, looking back in retrospect, we would have sent Ukraine everything it asked for the moment it asked for it, and we would have seen significant Ukrainian victories on the battlefield. They've done a terrific job of holding the line. But I fear that if a year from now it's another stalemate, there'll be this interesting question of, how does this end? Do the Ukrainians have an unreasonable expectation that they will retake all of their territory and Crimea? I'd like to see Ukrainians retake Crimea for various geopolitical reasons and military expenditure reasons, and the fact that Ukrainians eventually run out of guys. I mean, there's a question of, are we helping Ukraine win, or are we helping Ukraine continue a stalemate and pull off a Band-Aid slowly so that this could end with these current lines now, or this could end with these lines a year from now.
And what if it ends in the collapse of Ukraine? I tell the Ukraine military aid doves, if Ukraine collapses in the next year, I will have been wrong now. But if Putin collapses in the next year, they will have been wrong. And in between is along the spectrum, right? But I'm not going to be wrong completely, because unless you give them the tools to finish the job, they can't finish the job.
My other nagging fear, Hugh, is that Putin could die tomorrow. He could have a heart attack, or he could fall out of a building, which is apparently
happens a lot.
There, right? Yeah. The guy who takes over is effectively the guy who used to run the Russian IRS. He's milquetoast. He's picked for the job because he has no ambitions of ever replacing Vladimir Putin. Within 6 months, they'd have to have another election. Almost certainly, the guy who replaces Putin for the long term is going to have a very similar philosophy towards Putin. There is no nice, easygoing, peaceful Russian leader in the wings who's waiting to step in. So the problems we see with Russia under Putin are probably going to be the same problems 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This dream of a Russian empire isn't going to go away, unless, as you point out, Hugh, if it ends up with a just colossal defeat in Ukraine, and there's a different way down the road towards that, then maybe that does some damage to that dream, that idea that, someday we can reconquer Eastern Europe and we can be back to, we make Russia great again. We'll be
the history of Russia is of antagonism to the West, and we want to be the West. And that is the grand history of Russia, is up and down. So you need a Peter the Great to show up who wants to be part of Europe and not part of China. But meanwhile, China has turned Russia into a vassal state. Xi is flipping the script. Xi's going to Moscow the way that Nixon went to Beijing in the great three-party contest. You want to be in the two, not in the one. And now the United States is in the one. And that's a disaster.
Yeah, but actually, as much as I'm instinctively going to blame this administration for screwing things up, I think it is likely that Russia under Vladimir Putin and China under Xi Jinping, these two guys are always going to be attracted to each other because they have this same, we're going to be great again and we're going to put America in its place philosophy. And I think that the idea of the U.S. having any type of serious relationship or alliance or even just good, warm relations with either Putin or Xi Jinping was just never really in the cards.
Let me ask you, Jim, if the Republican presidential debates, let's say there are 12 of them, if they devoted 3 of them to national security only, would that be a good investment of time or a bad investment of time?
It would be a great investment of time. I don't know if we need 12, but I think more than one, and maybe you space them out because circumstances on the world stage can change, particularly in Russia and Ukraine. But yeah, like if you look, you talk to people who really know this China stuff, and they're not freaking out every single moment, but they describe things in everything from hypersonic missiles to the military applications of artificial intelligence, the surveillance state, just all the different ways in which China is stepping up in ways that we really weren't threatened by the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons were scary, but there was limited, once you used them, you couldn't, the effects were pretty clear. Hacking, quantum computing, the available code breaking, things like that. These
satellite
are I write about in my
weaponry.
novels. And,
It is Tom Clancy. Now, Jim Geraghty, people need to go read that Washington Post column. I just tweeted it out. I always appreciate when you join me. The Morning Jolt, of course, every day. Sign up for it at nationalreview.com. Thank you, Jim. Come right back. Remember, it's not the size of the check. It's what it buys. Don't go anywhere, America. You're buying another hour of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Stay tuned. I'll update that next hour. I'm joined now by Politico's Olivia Beavers, who wrote a story yesterday that I put out on Twitter. Got quite a lot of traction among my readers, which is the unauthorized release of 11 sets of veterans' records. That seems quite suspicious. So good morning, Olivia. Good to see you as always. Tell the audience about what you discovered, because that's quite a little scoop you got there.
Hey, Hugh, good to see you. Yeah, it's, and the story is still developing as we are discovering who these 11 people are, whether there's patterns. But essentially, Congressman Bacon and Congressman Zach Nunn, who are 2 Republicans who were in battleground districts, they basically were told by the U.S. Air Force that they had information, their personnel military records released to a third party, which has Democratic ties, and it was improperly done. So this third party was representing themselves as seeking their information for employment and other purposes, and so they released these military records, which presumably could have been used against them in the midterm campaign cycle. And the Air Force basically decided to investigate after it found that it had improperly released records of Jennifer Ruth Green, who was a sort of promising-looking candidate in Indiana for Republicans, and she had her military records released. They decided to investigate, and they found that 11 people total had their information released improperly, and it all largely seemed to be to this third-party group called the Due Diligence Group. We don't know.
The Due Diligence Group is believed to be Democratic operatives. Is that what we think it is?
So there was a letter that was sent from the Air Force to Congressman Bacon, and they named the individual, which is Abraham Payton, and he used to work at American Bridge, and that has strong Democratic ties.
Oh.
There was also, yes. So if you know that, like, that is a very Democratic leaning group. And we also found that there was about $110,000 paid from the DCCC, the House Democratic campaign arm, to the due diligence group during the last midterm cycle. So,
all right, Olivia, I want to pause here for everyone to understand.
Yeah.
What may be going on here is Democratic operatives flummoxed or hoodwinked or had cooperation within the Pentagon to release the records on would-be Republican members of Congress. Jen Ruth Green, frequently a guest on this show. I hope she moves to Jim Banks' district and runs for the Jim Banks state because she's a great candidate. Does the Air Force name names? Because someone's going to get fired at the Air Force. Somebody should not be giving away veterans' personnel records to Oppo researchers if they run for Congress. And that's, if the other 10 are people involved in politics, boy, do you have a blockbuster.
Well, so I'll be able to start hopefully reporting some of the other names. I've had some people reach out to me, so we just need to go through and vet them to see if that fits within the pattern. The Air Force is defending that they said that they didn't see any bad motivations or criminal motivations, but they did need to strengthen their process in terms of releasing this information. But the other component that they pointed to was that the person seeking it was doing it under false pretenses, which was that they were coming with Don Bacon's social security number and saying that they were seeking information,
that violates 28 USC 1001, the False Statements Act.
Mm-hmm. And
That's
so,
a crime.
I mean, it also would be, I'm blanking on it right now, the Privacy Act of, I think, you'll correct me on maybe the year 1978. But
there was a Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. Yep.
Yes. Yep. So that one, which they mentioned in the letter. And so we're going to have to see. I've reached out to due diligence. I tried to get in contact with Mr. Payton. I have not heard back from them. The DCCC did not respond to requests for comment. Some of the things that we're still seeing developing here is whether the Air Force has notified all of the 11 people by the time that I sent them my request for comment last week, and whether who the rest of the 11 are and if there's a trend there. So,
obviously a pattern. One could be a mistake. A pattern of 11, if they are all Republicans running for Congress, and I don't think they will be. But if they got Tom Cotton, if they got Mike Gallagher, if they've got every veteran, combat veteran, Zach Nunn, anyone who ran successfully for Congress or unsuccessfully, if someone leaked that, I'm not going to take the Air Force waving me off. I want to know from a congressional committee. I think Jim Banks chairs personnel, and I think Mike Waltz chairs readiness. Am I right about that, Olivia, on the Senate, on the House Armed Services Committee?
I believe so, but it's already sort of being investigated by Mike Rogers. He sent a letter to the Air Force asking for the information of who these 11 people were. And so is James Comer, who's the oversight chairman. And so they're both asking for information by February 27th. They want to know if any punishments or any firings have taken place from the Air Force personnel who released these records, what they're doing to sort of safeguard going forward, and whether, I guess,
what about the weaponization of the federal government subcommittee? Does Jim Jordan have a role in this? Because that's weaponizing the federal government if someone cooperated with a Democratic operative to get the dirt on military veterans.
I haven't heard that he's involved, and when I got a statement from the Speaker's office, he pointed to oversight and armed services. But I imagine that you're going to be seeing, as this starts to develop, different committees finding different areas to work in. Was this across
Olivia Beavers, you're on it. You've got the scoop of the week at Olivia_Beavers. Follow her on Twitter. Thank you, Olivia. Talk to you next week. Don't go anywhere. Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Hugh Hewitt live inside of Studio West, where it's cold and rainy in California. I'm headed to the Beltway after the show today, so tomorrow Kurt Schleicher will be sitting in for me as I get there and go about my business back on the air from inside the Beltway on Friday. I do want to let you folks know that when California has a bit of weather like this, it kind of freezes the state. If the Grapevine has snow, and it's going to have snow, it kind of freezes the state. The Grapevine is the 5 going up over the mountains to head into the Central Valley at Bakersfield. The Tejon Ranch, and if you've driven it, you know you really don't want to do it in the wintertime. You got to have change if you're going to go out to to Las Vegas as well on the 10. You're going to have change. There are places in the high desert where they're actually expecting snow today, which I have never, ever seen, although I've understood it happens occasionally. Usually it's down to 3,000 feet or 4,000 feet. It's really raining overnight, and so they could have a blizzard conditions in the high desert. Very unusual. What this is, of course, is the 1-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine 2.0. The first one occurred under President Obama, limited incursion but permanent feeling. And then this one was the attempt to take over Ukraine, seize Kyiv, seize and kill Zelensky, and basically remerge Ukraine into Russia, where it separated from after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But Ukraine does not want to be absorbed, and they are fighting back. President Biden, of course, visited Kyiv on Monday, and on Tuesday, both Putin gave a rambling, incoherent speech in which he accused the West of being the cause of the war, forcing their hands. Really a weird speech. He's further and further out of touch. The Wagner Group had yesterday sending out obscene audio messages directed at the Secretary of Defense and the General Staff. So there's divisions inside the Kremlin. The dictator is out of touch and paranoid. And Joe Biden is in Poland, and he gave a speech. And let's begin today's show on this February 22nd with that speech. The president in Warsaw yesterday, cut number 2.
Would we respond, or would we look the other way? Would we be strong, or would we be weak? Would all of our allies, would be united or divided? So tonight,
I told everyone yesterday that the key thing about the president going to Kyiv on Monday is that he can't give a speech to persuade, he can't give an interview to persuade, because he's 80 years old and he's infirm, and he's going to bumble parts of this speech. But it's important to be in Warsaw in front of the allies on the occasion to rally NATO, which is almost completely in support of Ukraine's independence and fight back. Hungary is a little bit of a teetering ally there, but they're in NATO, and thus far they're not sending anything, but they also haven't broken with NATO. Joe Biden in Warsaw, cut number 3.
So tonight, I speak once more to the people of Russia. The United States and the nations of Europe do not seek to control or destroy Russia. The West was not plotting to attack Russia, as Putin said today. And millions of Russian citizens who only want to live in peace with their neighbors are not the enemy. This war is never a necessity. It's a tragedy. President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice. He could end the war with a word. It's simple. If Russia stopped invading Ukraine, it would end the war. If Ukraine stopped defending itself against Russia, it would be the end of Ukraine.
That's a good line, and that's the bravo. He got one line off. That's a good line. If Putin stops fighting, it's the end of the war. If Ukraine starts fighting, it's the end of Ukraine. It's good. Let's go to the heart of the speech. Cut number 4.
1 year into this war, Putin no longer doubts the strength of our coalition, but he still doubts our conviction. He doubts our staying power. He doubts our continued support for Ukraine. He doubts whether NATO can remain unified. But there should be no doubt. Our support for Ukraine will not waver. NATO will not be divided, and we will not tire. President Putin's craven lust for land and power will fail, and the Ukrainian people's love for their country will prevail. Democracies of the world will stand guard over freedom today, tomorrow, and forever. So that's what's at stake here. Freedom. That's the message I carried to Kyiv yesterday, directly to the people of Ukraine. When President Zelensky said he came to the United States in December, quote, he said, this struggle will define the world and what our children and grandchildren, how they live, and then their children and grandchildren. He wasn't only speaking about the children and grandchildren of Ukraine. He was speaking about all of our children and grandchildren, yours and mine. We're seeing again today what the people of Poland and the people across Europe saw for decades. Appetites of the autocrat cannot be appeased. They must be opposed. Autocrats only understand one word: no, no,
That is
no.
another good line, poorly delivered. As I said, the president really cannot inspire. He lacks the ability anymore at 80 to deliver even a teleprompter line. But you can read it, and that reads pretty well. The only word they understand is no. And he did a little pandering. It's almost impossible with the president not to pander. His replay 8-track goes in, and we got a little bit of that. Cut number 6.
And Mr. President, the connection between Polish and American people.
That's not the speech. I don't want to mix up the speech. I'm sorry. That was a comment that he made at a press conference. So let's go to the end of the speech. Cut number 7.
The democracies of the world have to deliver for our people. As we gather tonight, the world, in my view, is at an inflection point. The decisions we make over the next 5 years or so are going to determine and shape our lives for decades.
You know what that is? I'm running for re-election. That's I'm running for re-election part. Donald Trump responded yesterday to the anniversary of the Ukraine invasion with this statement, cut number 18. Oh, it's not loaded. Cut number 18 is really an eye-opener about the division in the Republican Party, covered by Aaron Blake, and I will in the Washington Post today. He called it a chasm. It's not a chasm. On one end, you've got Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, traditional Reagan hawks. Give the Ukraine the tools; they'll finish the job. Give them what they need right now, and stop turning this into Vietnam. Meaning, you don't want a little bit more aid, and don't ever send advisors, and then don't get trapped in a quagmire. But Ukraine hawks like me we want all the aid to get there fast. And Ukraine skeptics on the far side, Donald Trump basically sounds like he wants to end Ukraine aid. Ron DeSantis is somewhere in the middle saying no blank checks. Here is the test. What would it take you to declare your position today would be wrong in a year? All right. If Ukraine breaks and folds, despite all of our weaponry and despite all of our aid, and despite tens of thousands of casualties and the destruction of the country and the misery within a year from now, I will have been wrong and Ukraine hawks will have been wrong. It was foreordained. We ought not to have depleted our resupply and done the best we can to stop them. But if Ukraine is still standing, it will be in suspense. It will still be a big issue in Iowa and New Hampshire for the Republicans a year from now. And if you're a Ukraine skeptic or opposed to anything in Ukraine, and Russia folds, or Putin is removed, or they reel backwards from the Crimea and they lose more ground, then we will have been right, the Ukraine hawks, and you will have been wrong. So ask yourself now, this is not a question of running for office for most of us. It's not a question of whether or not it matters what we think. It might impact our votes, but it really becomes, what will persuade you that your position today on Ukraine aid is wrong in a year? You ought to be able to articulate that to yourself. Do we have time for Trump? Cut number, the former president is going to East Palestine today. Cut number 18. This is a video, of course, stopping the warmongers and the globalists.
World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers and America last globalists and the deep state, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the national security industrial complex. One of the reasons I was the only president in generations who didn't start a war is that I was the only president who rejected the catastrophic advice of many of Washington's generals, bureaucrats, and the so-called diplomats who only know how to get us into conflict, but they don't know how to get us out.
I'll play the rest of it a little bit later in the show. I do wish, as my friend Mark sent me a text, I wish Biden would say the same thing about Israel. If the Palestinians stopped fighting, there would be peace. If the Israelis stopped fighting, there would be no Israel. That's true. Well said, Mark. Captain Vandroff sending that to me this morning. I'll be right back. Your phone calls, lots more news. I'll cover it all. Ukraine anniversary of the war, invasion of Russia is today, and we'll be talking about it throughout the show with Congressman Mike Gallagher, Jim Geraghty, Olivia Beavers, and more on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Stay tuned. Back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt on the anniversary of the second Russian war against Ukraine, the first anniversary. We're going to talk more about Ukraine today with Congressman Mike Gallagher, just back from Taiwan. listened to former President Trump's declaration yesterday about warmongers in D.C. and cover that throughout. Let me do the other headlines since I began the day with the speech that President Biden gave late yesterday in the United States time in Poland. It was at nighttime after Putin spoke in the morning in Moscow. And the president will be returning to the U.S. today, I believe. I hope he goes straight to East Palestine, runs into Donald Trump there, and pledges support for the people of East Palestine. Joe Biden vows Russia will never prevail in Ukraine. You heard that in the first segment. What is Joe Biden doing? He's running for re-election. Thus, the New York Times dutifully reports Biden administration announces new border crackdown. New border crackdown? Reversal of policy, maybe. And will it be effective? I don't know. They're going to go back to something like Trump. You don't get to claim asylum if you didn't stop somewhere along the way, for example, Mexico, and file your asylum application on an online app. I don't think it's going to do a thing because you lead by example. You need to build the wall. You need to complete the double-sided fence. It's not going to do a thing. But Joe Biden realizes it's his greatest vulnerability, crime in the border, running for re-election, fentanyl, and he's going to do his best to pretend like he cares about the border. Supreme Court heard arguments in the Google case yesterday on Section 230, and most legal observers have concluded based on the questions that they have no idea what's going to happen. A few are saying the court's going to defer to the legislature here because Section 230 is a congressional act and it's really a legislative issue. The only issue that really matters is, does Section 230 change these platforms into state action by virtue of the immunity that they are given from lawsuit? And I don't know. I didn't listen to the argument. It's interesting. I'm going to wait for the court to do the heavy lifting on that. In grand jury news from Georgia, the Trump grand jury, the special grand jury, recommended multiple indictments, the forewoman says. She would not discuss specific indictments in the special grand jury's report, but noted that its recommendations were, quote, not going to be some giant plot twist. I don't know what that means. I asked the former president last month if he's received a target letter yet, and he hadn't. And so I just don't know. Someone should ask him in East Palestine today, did you receive a target letter from them? Because he should have gotten one if an indictment's been recommended about him. It's going to take some kind of national calamity to obscure the divide in the country, but that doesn't mean the country is going to divide. There's a divide in the country, but the country is not going to divide. The country is going to do it through politics and through the mediated means of republicanism, not the Republican Party, but republic. The republic that was established by the framers is going to function well. Constitution is really functioning well, and it will continue to do so. I want to go back to, though, the divide in the Republican Party. Aaron Blake at the Washington Post writes this morning, DeSantis and Haley highlight 2024 chasm on Ukraine. It's not a chasm, and Aaron didn't write that headline. There are different gradations of support for Ukraine in the Republican Party. And I would put on the hawkish side former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former Vice President Mike Pence and former Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley and many other people like Tom Cotton, Mike Gallagher, Congressman Gallagher will be coming along. And I'd put over on the skeptic side of the aid Donald Trump. And Donald Trump released a video yesterday that I played a little bit of in the first segment. I want to play more of it right now. Cut number 18, former President Trump was on his way to East Palestine, Ohio today, talking about the warmongers in Washington, D.C., cut 18. It begins a little bit quiet, then it rolls.
World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers and America Last globalists and the deep state, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the national security industrial complex. One of the reasons I was the only president in generations who didn't start a war is that I was the only president who rejected the catastrophic advice of many of Washington's generals, bureaucrats, and the so-called diplomats who only know how to get us into conflict, but they don't know how to get us out. For decades, we've had the very same people, such as Victoria Nuland and many others just like her, obsessed with pushing Ukraine toward NATO, not to mention the State Department support for uprisings in Ukraine. These people have been seeking confrontation for a long time, much like the case in Iraq and other parts of the world, and now we're teetering on the brink of World War III. And a lot of people don't see it, but I see it, and I've been right about a lot of things. They all say Trump's been right about everything. None of this excuses in any way the outrageous and horrible invasion of Ukraine 1 year ago, which would have never happened if I was your president, not even a little chance. But it does mean that here in America, we need to get rid of the corrupt globalist establishment that has botched every major foreign policy decision for decades, and that includes President Biden, whose own people said he's never made a good decision when it comes to looking at other countries and looking at wars. We have to replace them with people who support American interests. Over our 4 years in the White House, we made incredible progress in putting the America Last contingent aside and bringing the world to peace. And now we're going to complete the mission. The State Department, Pentagon, and national security establishment will be a very different place by the end of my administration. In fact, just into my administration, it'll be a very different place, and it'll get things done, just like I did 4 years ago. We never had it so good. We'll also stop the lobbyists and the big defense contractors from going in and pushing our senior military and national security officials toward conflict, only to reward them when they retire with lucrative jobs, getting paid millions and millions of dollars. Take a look at the globalist warmonger donors backing our opponents. That's because they're candidates of war. I am the president who delivers peace, and it's peace through strength. There was a reason we had no conflict. There was a reason we didn't get into wars, because other countries respected us. I entirely built, all right from the beginning, rebuilt our military. It's a big reason for that. They didn't want to mess around with the United States, and now they're laughing at us. We could end the Ukraine conflict in 24 hours with the right leadership. At the end of my next 4 years, the warmongers and frauds and failures of the senior ranks of our government will all be gone, and we will have a new group of competent national security officials who believe in defending America's vital interests above all else. Thank you very much.
That's Donald Trump yesterday, and the Wall Street Journal replies this morning from the Hawk camp. Well, let's actually play former Vice President Pence on with Hannity on talking about Ukraine last night and Vladimir Putin, cut number 15.
To the foreign stage, and they've been playing catch up ever since. But I really do believe that it's absolutely essential that we embrace that Reagan doctrine. I've stood closer than I am to you and looked Vladimir Putin right in the eye and told him things he didn't want to hear. And I got to tell you, if you think he's going to stop if he captures Ukraine, in reestablishing the old Soviet sphere of influence.
You think he'd go to Poland?
You got another thing coming. I don't know Poland, but
he has
I
other territorial
Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, these other countries are already beginning to either feel the fear or begin to fall in line. And so I think it's important that we hold the line here.
Hold the line here. Is the Hawk position. Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo sharing it with the former vice president. In the middle is Ron DeSantis, no blank checks, but he didn't give any more details than that. And then you've got Donald Trump basically saying it's warmongering. The Wall Street Journal this morning. A year of war in Ukraine hasn't changed Vladimir Putin, and we hope Western politicians preaching peace were listening to his speech on Tuesday. The Russian promised nothing but more war and blamed the West for it. His choice in turn means there's only a binary choice for the West. Give Ukraine the weapons to win, or abandon Ukraine and live with the fallout for decades. I'm going to go down to the bottom here. The Russians have lost some 2,000 tanks, half the operational fleet, according to estimates, and appear to be hauling old Soviet equipment out of storage. Mr. Putin has turned to Iran for a steady supply of drones and other military equipment. Now he's hoping that China will ship Russia weapons. Significantly more than 100,000 Russians are dead or wounded, the Pentagon said. But Mr. Putin is throwing 200,000 more into the fight, even with little training or equipment. Mr. Putin's goal is unchanged: control most or all of Ukraine and incorporate it into his greater Russian empire. He still thinks he can outlast the Ukrainian government and its Western supporters. Many in the U.S. and Europe are ready to head to a negotiating table, but Mr. Putin is not. The only settlement he has in mind is Ukraine's surrender. The fastest route to peace, then, is defeating Mr. Biden, which the Biden administration still seems reluctant to admit. Mr. Biden hasn't wavered in his rhetorical support for Ukraine, in his Tuesday speech in Poland struck the note that autocrats cannot be appeased and must be opposed. Yet his air of triumphalism is premature. Ukraine could still lose. This has been his pattern for decades, his pattern for a year. I was going back to Joe Biden's pattern of being wrong about every major foreign policy issue for 40 years, according to Robert Gates. And he's wrong on Ukraine. It's an incrementalism approach, it's a Vietnam approach. And maybe that changed on Monday when he went to Kyiv. I don't know. The Biden team throws up reasons why a certain weapon, tanks, Patriot missile defense, HIMARS, can't be provided to Ukraine. The system is too complex. The training will take too long. Then these objections suddenly vanish after criticism in Congress and from the public, and Ukraine gets the goods. Can we skip that and provide F-16 fighter jets right now? It's A-10s, Wall Street Journal. They need the A-10s. The F-16s would protect the A-10s. Getting Ukraine the weapons they need is increasingly urgent. If Russia receives arms from China, the war will descend into an even bloodier stalemate or Ukrainian defeat. Political support could fray in European capitals and in Washington, even as Beijing's involvement raises the global risks of defeat. To that end, Mr. Biden might speak more directly to the Americans who are increasingly skeptical of the stakes in Ukraine and ground his case for U.S. support in core national interests. It's in your interest and it's in my interest and the interest of your children and grandchildren that Putin be defeated and that he be removed by his associates in the Kremlin. The risks of backing Ukraine are real. The Wall Street Journal and I and all the Ukraine hawks announce this, but the risks of banning it are greater. The Ukrainians have put up an audacious fight, but absent more advanced U.S. arms, the story could still end with Mr. Putin a greater menace to Europe, China emboldened, and the United States weaker. That's not a plan to desire. I really do believe, and I put this, I hope you'll follow me on Twitter, because I do cover national security more than almost any other thing. Here's the useful question, and you can respond to it. Lots of people are. I just put it out there, and I'll put it in a post column next week. Useful question to ask proponents and opponents of continuing or increasing U.S. military aid, opponents and proponents. Now, if you have an opinion on Ukraine, and you've been vocal about it, what result would oblige you to rethink your support or opposition, and in what time frame? Intellectual honesty demands that if you're a Ukraine hawk, you outline what means that you were wrong. Intellectual honesty demands that if you are a Ukraine dove and you don't want any more aid going to Ukraine, you outline a result that will prove you were wrong. We know that Democrats who refused aid to South Vietnam in 1974 after Nixon resigned and Ford took over brought about the fall of Saigon a year later. They were wrong. We know that when President Obama pulled troops out of Iraq prematurely on an arbitrary deadline in 2012, ISIS followed. He was wrong. It took Trump to clean up that mess. And so you got to look ahead and say, what makes me right, what makes me wrong? I agree with Trump's former national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, who said yesterday, Putin's got to be beaten. And how would you prove Robert O'Brien, and that's my position, by the way, and Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence and Nikki Haley and people like me on the air wrong? You would show a defeated Ukraine in a year. All the aid didn't work. And then the question will be, did we give them what they needed when they needed it? That would be the answer. So let me also tell you, Vivek Ramaswamy announced for president yesterday. I'm going to do most of that on the Grand Old Pod. You can only listen to the Grand Old Pod if you're a subscriber to the Universe. I'll spend a half hour on Vivek, on the state of the race, who's gotten in. Tim Scott's on his listening tour in Iowa. What's it mean, the Ukraine situation? That's on the Grand Old Pod. Republican news for Republicans by a Republican me, and occasionally Generalissimo, who does Tuesday, Thursdays, and sometimes Fridays, or maybe it's Tuesdays and sometimes Thursdays and Friday, and I do Monday and Wednesday on the Grand Old Pod. Go and find out. Republican news for Republicans by Republicans at the Grand Old Pod, only if you join theuniverse.com. Stay tuned, America. This is the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There is so much in the news today because it's an anniversary and it's easy for the news to prepare for it and get ready for it. How long can Russia keep fighting the war in Ukraine? The Financial Times asked this morning. Russia's top paramilitary chief, it's not paramilitary, it's a private mercenary group, the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, suggested his vaunted access to Vladimir Putin may be on the wane because he can't get in to see Putin. And he is the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, this comes from the New York Times, accused the country leadership, military leadership, its defense minister, its most senior general, of treason on Tuesday. All right, that is not a good sign for Russia, but it's a very bad sign for Putin. Putin also announced yesterday that it may end formal arms control. We should be so lucky. New Start's a disaster for everyone because China's not a party to it. China's Xi Jinping plans Russia visit as Putin wages war in Ukraine. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is preparing to visit Moscow for a summit with Russia's Putin in the coming months. According to people familiar with his plan, as Vladimir Putin wages war in Ukraine, portrays himself as a standard bearer against a U.S.-led global order. So the axis of evil 2.0 is Iran, China, and Russia, and the one you got to worry about is Beijing. The other two are just fragile, hollow states supported by Beijing. Russia, China challenge U.S.-led world order, according to the Wall Street Journal this morning. And that's, if you listen to Hugh Show, that's not news. We cover this every single day. We also cover longer stories like this from Bloomberg. Russia's war on Ukraine, China's rise, expose U.S. military failings. Cost overruns and a culture of risk aversion underscore the problems at the Pentagon. Our acquisition program is a mess, and a total mess. The Future Combat System is the Bobo doll of the month at the Pentagon because it doesn't work and it spent a lot of money. But our planes work pretty well and our submarines work really well, and we're a year behind the Columbia class, our nuclear deterrent, the spine of our triad, the most important part of our triad. And I know the Air Force people love the B-21 and they love their missileers, love their missiles and cyber and space, say cyber and space. But the key is the Columbia class new to replace the Ohio class. Now, it's going to be a downgrade, obviously, because it's not named Ohio, but it's going to be an upgrade in terms of the potency, and we need a dozen of them. I think we're slated for a dozen of them, and we need them yesterday, and we're behind, and we need lots more guided missile frigates out of Wisconsin. We need lots more everything in the United States Navy, because the China face-off is not a land war in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a sea war, and it's a missile war, and Taiwan needs rearming. A couple other stories I just don't want to make sure you miss. Mexico's ex-top security official, their number one fellow for their war on drugs, turns out that Genaro Garcia Luna, once the architect and public face of Mexico's bloody war on its powerful cartel criminal groups, was convicted Tuesday in a New York courtroom of betraying his country and colleagues by taking millions of dollars in bribes from the violent gang cartels he was meant to be pursuing. Failed state taking shape on the South. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has talked about ungoverned spaces in Mexico, south of El Paso and San Diego, and he's right. Ungoverned space, like having Somalia on our border, and Joe Biden's not doing anything. Big story in Israel this morning. Israeli scientists say they cured mice of Alzheimer's using a newly developed molecule. Small trial, small test, great deal of hope. You got to get rid of the plaque that accompanies Alzheimer's. And this molecule destroyed it in mice. Now, lot way to go. Walmart, Home Depot give cautious outlook as shoppers spend more on basics. So that should have helped markets yesterday. It didn't. It was a terrible day on the markets. And Vivek Ramaswamy has jumped in. He filed to run for president. I'll talk a lot about that on the Grand Old Pod. I'll play his announcement. We'll talk about the reactions across the board. I've got to run a general morning news show. People need the news when they go to work and they want to talk about it. And we're going to talk about Ukraine aid next hour. 1-800-520-1234. 1-800-520-1234. I want to pose my question again. Wherever you are on the spectrum of Ukraine, whether you are a hawk like former Vice President Pence, former Secretary of State Pompeo, former UN Ambassador and Governor Nikki Haley, or you're a very great skeptic of it now, and the warmongers in D.C. like former President Trump, or you're in between like Ron DeSantis, who says no blank check, but he also doesn't stop aid. I think Tom Cotton, Mike Gallagher, and the people I listen to are going to be in favor of more, faster, better to get the war over. More, faster, better. Vivek Ramaswamy is really on the ESG crusade.